Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, just a few questions to the proponent of the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the conversation we've just had, to make it clear that it is only when conversion therapy is administered or done in these various shocking ways that you just elaborated, then and then only will what we are talking with this amendment apply. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
It would be any conversion therapy, any practicing or administering of conversion therapy as defined in the bill itself would be a violation so long as money exchanged hands as applied in this particular section. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I know the amendment does capture part of the underlying bill, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as we talk about the bill in itself. But just to be clear on the amendment, which is where we are at this stage, so if as Representative Cadilora talked about, that if anything is available, not, in as much as I just want to make sure I get my hands around this practice part where there are books available or there are other videos, that, this, and the other that are available on the subject matter. Not that it is being practiced, but they're just available. And I did hear you say so, hopefully they're not available. But in the event, because we have to look at it in trade and commerce. So if those books, videos, any of those were available, and obviously there's an exchange, there is money being exchanging hands at that point, would that be involved or included in this amendment as we speak? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, you are still free to purchase a book or a video should you like. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, in the process of buying a book or a video, as I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of times conversation happens between the owner of the store and the person who's buying the book or the video. And if a conversation were to happen on the subject matter, and the person, the book owner or the store owner or the person who's employed in the store, not necessarily the owner, expresses his or her views on conversion therapy and seems to think that conversion therapy is okay, is acceptable, so on and so forth, prior to the sale of the book. Not that he or she is trying to sell the book, but just being asked a question on the subject matter. Would the person who talks about the subject, and B, the owner, if that is not the same person, would they be liable through this amendment? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
No, so long as no money is exchanging hands so that the person behind the counter is having a conversation to allow for a directive that the person purchasing it is going to be requiring that conversion therapy. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, there is a conversation between the person who comes into the store and purchases the book. But prior to the purchase of the book, where obviously there is an exchange of money at that point in time, is a lengthy discussion between the store owner or the employee on the risks, the benefits, so on and so forth, on the subject matter. And at the end of that discussion, sometimes it'd be minutes, sometimes it could be longer, given the fact on the significance of the subject, which, as you very, very articulately said, is a very, very deep subject matter. So at the end of that half an hour, 45 minutes discussion, if the store owner seems to direct that person towards the purchase of the book, that's the end result. The end result is the purchase of a book or a video. But there was, I wouldn't say a direct, but an indirect kind of a suggestion. Would any of those people, the book owner or the employer, would they be held liable? Because there is an exchange in terms of money. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those are the questions on the amendment, and I want to thank the good proponent of the amendment for those answers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, a few questions to the bill as amended.
Please proceed, sir.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of clarification, lines 3 talks about any practice or treatment. So through you, Mr. Speaker, what is this practice and what is this treatment that is being referred to in line 3? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That practice or treatment would be somebody engaged looking to seek to change the person's sexual identity or gender identity. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, treatment I can see, we talked about shock therapy, we talked about all those different kinds of barbaric things that the good representative had discussed in his opening remarks. I get that. But what is the difference between practice and treatment? Because that's what we are voting on today. And for legislative intent, we need to be clear the difference between practice and treatment. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Practice or treatment also, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the amendment, also, well, I take that back, Mr. Speaker. Practice or treatment would be anybody who is attempting to sit down and engage someone to change their sexual identity or their gender identity. Practice could be once. Treatment, many would assume, is multiple sessions. So it's just basically the catch-all to get anybody who's going to do this once or going to do this a number of times. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the practice, because that's the part that I'm most concerned about. Treatment is very clear and obvious. Through you, Mr. Speaker, if somebody in the healthcare field talks about this treatment, talks about what this treatment is and what a treatment does, like we do day in and day out. Through you, Mr. Speaker, a conversation on the treatment and the treatment options. Obviously, at the end of the day, there is an exchange of money because it is an office visit, whether it's a copay or in a regular conversation. If this were to come up, which it will and which does, through you, Mr. Speaker, is that considered practice? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, if a conversation on this subject matter were to occur, and an extensive, lengthy one, because that is the subject matter that they're coming here to talk about, the parents are concerned, the child is concerned, under 18. And in this conversation, the healthcare provider, and I see later in the bill, we have a long list of people who would qualify as healthcare providers, and appropriately so. So through you, Mr. Speaker, any of these healthcare providers we're just talking about discussing the subject matter and giving their thoughts of what it is, going back in history to what happened to where we are right now. Would that be considered a practice of conversion therapy? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A conversation is not practice. You are permitted to have a conversation, so long as there is no directive that at the end of that conversation, the intent is that I'm going to change your sexual orientation or gender identity. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was very clear, and I'm glad you said that in so many words through you, Mr. Speaker, because a conversation, which is, in a loose sense of word, is practice as well, but here we are making it very clear that as long as a conversation, whether it's brief, long, whatever, that conversation does not directly say, right now, this is what I'm talking to you about, and I'm going to be doing this conversion therapy on you. So the conversation, as long as it is not tied to treatment, that healthcare provider will not be held liable. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is correct. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, lines 8 and 9 going down the bill talks about various exclusions, and they're essentially in the same field as the practice that we talked about in terms of counseling. So through you, Mr. Speaker, if the good representative could tell us what can be done in the process of a conversation in terms of counseling, which would not be considered that you are breaking the law or you're doing something inappropriate. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate that question, Representative. So if you look further in lines 9, 10, and 11, we do have the counseling that would not be included under this definition. Simply put, we do not want to prevent families from seeking out medical or healthcare or mental assistance to sit down and discuss this new family dynamic oftentimes, and allow them to explore that and how to best kind of work through that and come to some sort of resolution, so long as the end directive is that we're not going to change your sexual orientation or gender identity. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that's the part that I'm having a little difficulty with. Through you, Mr. Speaker, when you begin a conversation, I mean, a conversation could take you, like including this conversation today, could take us in any and multiple directions. So what I'm not clear about is, A, you're allowed to have a conversation, B, you're allowed to have counseling, as long as it does not lead to the treatment. That's the part that how could a conversation, how could counseling be directly tied with treatment? And I'm looking at it from the person who's providing the service, in fairness to him or her, providing this counseling service, providing this conversation. And what if at the end of the day, that person does seek conversion therapy? Maybe not in our state, and I'll come to that a little later. Maybe it's available somewhere else. And so the person does seek conversion therapy. At the end of the conversation, would that medical provider be held liable? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as long as your conversation is neutral and the intent is not that that healthcare practitioner is going to be a part of that conversion therapy, they can have that conversation for as long as they would like. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the person who's having the conversation, it could be a primary care provider, it could be a pediatrician, because we're talking about below the age of 18 here, a family practitioner. That person is not providing the treatment. The treatment is provided by somebody else. But the conversation, the directive, is provided by the healthcare provider. So that's where I'm a little bit confused about the intent here, because it is not the treatment we're talking about. It is A, the conversation, and of course, the counseling that goes along with that. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Mr. Speaker, if you'd ask the representative to restate a question, I believe there was one in there.
Representative Srinivasan, would you care to restate a question?
No problem at all. Definitely. With pleasure, Mr. Speaker. So through you, Mr. Speaker, the person having the conversation, the person doing the counseling, is or could be the primary care provider, as it could be by and large. It could be a family practitioner, pediatrician, since it is below the age of 18. So the person providing the conversation on the subject matter, A, and then leaving it to the family, leaving it to that individual to decide what they're going to do with that conversation and with that counseling. And let's say they take the path of going for conversion therapy wherever it is available. If not available in Connecticut, available somewhere else. In that case, since the primary care had the conversation, the healthcare provider does not have to be an MD. You know, we have a long list of healthcare providers. Any of them providing that, their conversation on the subject matter, but did not result in not having conversion therapy. That's my concern, that this person had a conversation, went through counseling, but at the end of it all, decides to go with conversion therapy anyway at the end of that conversation or counseling. Would that healthcare provider be in any way liable? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
No, through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Going to line 39. It talks about no healthcare provider shall engage in conversion therapy. Through you, Mr. Speaker, if the good representative could just give us what does this engagement include? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That would also be, you could exchange the word exchange for practice or administer. So, and that, referring back to the amendment we spoke about earlier, the language we did clean up there in that amendment to mirror that. So the intent behind the word engage would also be to practice or administer. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, could the good representative tell us, as we speak right now, in how many states conversion therapy is still being practiced in our country? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Yes, it's well, I can tell you, I can flip it on you. I can say that it's currently banned in 5 states and the District of Columbia. We do know that it is being practiced in a number of other states at the very moment. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, if disciplinary action has to be taken against somebody who continues to provide the conversion therapy, even after it is banned, will that be under the umbrella of DPH? Will they be the ones that will be doing the disciplinary action, or will it be Department of Consumer Protection, or both? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would be the Department of Public Health, and you can reference Section 2B for clarification on that. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, and my final question to the good proponent of the bill as amended. These services, in terms of being provided to families, to individuals that are looking for a conversation. Through you, Mr. Speaker, are any of these services that are permissible would be, as I understand that, as long as it is conversation, it is permissible to have that conversation, to have that consultation, but the actual rendering of the services, that is what we are banning. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Curry.
Thank you. That is correct. We are not going to violate any First Amendments and allow you to have an open conversation with whomever you choose to have that conversation with. Again, so long as the directive at the end of that is not to go forward and change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
And Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, in continuing this about services that can be provided, I know Representative Sampson brought out the important point that bothers me as well, and that concerns me about the bill is that it is a good bill. It's definitely a bill in the right direction. Obviously, I'm going to be supporting the bill because I think that's the direction we need to go. But to me, the bill did not go far enough. And I understand here we always begin in small steps and take it forward, because here it is all about the trade. It's all about the exchange of money for services that are rendered. So the same services if somebody is unfortunate enough that these services are kind of forced upon that individual and money is not exchanged and the services are just provided, as I understand this bill, that would not be banned because there has not been an exchange as far as trade and money is concerned. And that is probably where, going forward, whether it be in the next session or in the sessions to come, where we would look at it in strengthening this bill, which is a good first step, but strengthening it further, and regardless of whether there is an exchange of money or not. Obviously, I'm well aware that there could be implications of all of that, but as a healthcare provider, as somebody who feels that these people need to be protected, need to be adequately protected, that none of this conversion therapy can ever happen, regardless of whether there's an exchange of money or not. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Representative Srinivasan.